Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation, A Call to Active Solidarity, Migrants in the United States During the Second Trump Administration. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Alejandro Olayo-Méndez is an assistant professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. He is a Jesuit Catholic priest from the West Coast province of the United States. There are some of us here who affiliate that way. His research focuses on migrants and refugees' livelihoods and the role of humanitarian organizations in contexts of migration and forced displacement. Father Alejandro has conducted extensive ethnographic research along migration routes in Mexico. His upcoming book, Humanitarianism from Below, by NYU Press, analyzes how casas de migrantes, or migrant shelters, shape the migratory processes in this region. In the past year, he has traveled extensively across the Mexico-US border, exploring migrants' digital practices, the impact of CBP One, which is a free mobile app from US Customs and Border Protection that allows users to access a variety of CBP services, and migrants' well-being. He published part of his findings in the report Navigating the US-Mexico Border, Digital Practices of Migrants and Their Psychosocial Needs with Jesuit Refugee Service of the United States. He has published an article discussing the experience of Latino immigrants in the United States during the pandemic. He led a research project with the Jesuit Network with Migrants, Latin America and the Caribbean, which explores integration practices and accompaniment of refugees and migrants in 14 countries and their lived experiences in those countries. Father Alejandro received a doctorate of philosophy degree in international development from the University of Oxford in 2019. He holds a master's in migration studies also from the University of Oxford, a Master of Divinity from Boston College, and a Master of Social Work from Loyola University, Chicago, where he distinguished himself as a student of St. Augustine. We are delighted to have him join us for this timely presentation. Please welcome Father Alejandro.
Thank you very much. I think it really sounds more impressive than it really is. So, but I try to, Father McCarthy was kind of like my professor when I was at Loyola, so that's why the reference at St. Augustine, because I took a course on Augustine with him. He's an expert, also graduate from Oxford, by the way. So, thank you very much, and West Coast. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be back home at the Cloud School of Theology and Ministry, where now I can say some years ago I graduated. Actually, I also got my STL from here, and my thesis was kind of like around how to understand that, what kind of lenses do we need to have to understand migration. I'm going to start this presentation by making a statement. When we talk about migration, when we talk about migrants, refugees, policy, we need to understand that we are talking about people. We are talking about individuals, women, men, children, that have lives like any of us, that have dreams, that have struggles, that have hopes. And I invite you really to keep that in the background as I move through different parts in this presentation. Migration is not only about policy, it's about people, like many of the realities in which we move in. And to illustrate that, I'm going to show you some images From my work in the past year, part of the fall of 2023 and the spring of 2024, I have the fortune to travel all along the U.S.-Mexico border, from San Diego, Tijuana, all the way to Brownsville, Matamoros. There are 8 ports of entry. I won't go into details where migrants could access and try to enter the country and seek asylum. So I visited and conducted interviews in all those ports of entry. When we say that I'm an ethnographer, I go and talk to people. I go and stay the places. I see, I can ask questions, and really I try to understand or to capture the realities, not only from the place or the dynamics that are involved in migration processes, but also how do people feel? It's difficult, and I think through the years, to really walk in the migrants' shoes, but it's about understanding how do they see the world? How do they experience these realities? So these are some pictures that I'm going to show you that is from this year that has been wonderful. One of those, as you can see, is Nogales. Victor and Jared, they work, 2 of the Jesuits studying here. They work for several years there. So that is one of the shelters that we have is run by some religious congregations and the Jesuits. And it's actually, this picture is at the very beginning. It's January 13 when the app started to be used. So it's the very day in which, in that day, Victor was running like crazy, trying to organize people and to explain what they needed to do. Then we have Ciudad Juarez. Ciudad Juarez became a great destination, a port of entry for Venezuelans. And amazingly, a lot of the responses, well, not amazingly, I think we need to recognize more and more and give more credit the local responses that exist. In a way, the shelter in Nogales is a local response, is the Christian community responding to the vulnerability and to the needs of the people. They see the pain, they see the need, they recognize the other, and they respond. And in those responses, also I think it's a very interesting gendering perspective in humanitarian assistance. A lot of the people working in these places are women. And a lot of them are also belong to religious congregations, sisters religious congregations that put really their lives on the line to tend to the needs of migrants. In Ciudad Juarez, this is the cathedral. So there's a very, very committed woman, Cristina Coronado. She is just amazing. She was able to organize people to serve close to 600 meals every single day from Monday to Friday to Venezuelan migrants arriving at that day. There's also at that end is another shelter. It's a shelter that receives LGBTQ people from the LGBT community. So even all these responses also tend to particular needs and cater to particular needs of people. Then you have different realities. You have a shelter in Tijuana. Here at this shelter, at that time when I visited, there were 120 people. There are different sizes of shelters. There are different kind of responses. But then you have, of course, these little tents that people, families use, and that's what it is provided. So also the resources that are available, they are not plenty. They are very difficult. Then you have realities like in Matamoros, which is a camp that was next to the bridge at that moment. Later on, a couple of months later after that camp, the camp was removed by the government, and then there was a negotiation to put them in another place. Then you have Reynosa, one of the most dangerous cities along the border. A lot of Haitians go there for different reasons. And one of the most interesting things in the past year has been the rise of the use of cell phones. If in the past years, probably all the way to 2016, 2018, it was rare or it was a luxury that a migrant may have a cell phone, now it's a necessity. people need to have a cell phone or needed to have a cell phone to do that. That's why I got interested into exploring the digital practices of migrants. How do they gather information? How do they enter into this world to use an application, and how they face the different challenges? Then you have Reynosa also is a shelter. This is a shelter in the middle run by a religious congregation. Women, they're amazing. I live with them during my doctoral work for 3 months. They are just unbelievable, and it's great. And then you have Reynosa, another camp. And this is what I want you I have permission from these women to show their pictures. One of the things that I want you to be aware is when I talk about people, this is the kind of people that I encounter, that I have encountered along the border and in my research. I won't say more about those stories, but I can just in a way for privacy purposes, but I can tell you that these two women, the things that they have faced in their countries of origins, the levels of violence, and at the same time, the resilience that they have to overcome every obstacle has been amazing. I was extremely, extremely edified by their testimony and by their sharing. So when I talk about people, when I talk about the human face of migration, this is what I mean. Women with dreams, and women that are also very clever about how to protect their children. This is it's an important anecdote. In interviewing her, we were at the tent, of course. Her little daughter, you cannot see her there, but her little daughter was in the back. There's a part in the interview in which she's sharing the reasons because she left her town. And they were very graphic, and there are many details that are very violent. Before she moved into that part of the interview, she turns to her little girl and tells her, ve a jugar, ve a ver a la vecina aquí a las 3 tiendas adelante. Go and look for the neighbor and wait for me there. She's 3 tents down the road. It was a way for this mother to protect the child from the things that she would be hearing, the things that she would be sharing. So in all this also, we need to understand how people manage, how people cope, how people get creative, and the resilience that they have to overcome and confront different challenges. Of course, you have many children along the way. There are a lot of needs that, particularly in this recent wave of migrants seeking asylum in the US, a lot of families. So the point of showing up these pictures is really to show you the human face, that when we talk about immigrants in the US, these are some of the people that we encounter here. And just like in these past years, we have seen a significant numbers of people seeking asylum in the US from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, Haiti, Mexico. In the past, there have been other people, other communities that have arrived to the US seeking for asylum, seeking for an opportunity. And in a way, if you want to put it in this way, seeking the American dream. We can ask the question from a more critical perspective, whatever that means for us. So this is the human face. So remember, always that we talk about migrants, we talk about people. And then we move to the headlines that create narratives. And probably, honestly, as I was preparing this for this talk, it's like, I cannot keep up with everything that comes up in the newspapers. Of course, when I see the video announcing a particular type of permanent residency that will be kind of considered the gold card, it's, how can I keep up with this? So these are some of the things, the headlines that have been in the news. Trump deports hundreds of people to third countries, leaving them in legal limbo. Reverse migration begins at the US-Mexico border. First deportation flight to Costa Rica arrives with 135 migrants from the US. We are in danger. Migrants deported from US were locked in a hotel and held at a remote camp in Panama. The HS memo lays out plans for detained migrants on Fort Bliss and other US bases. So in this time, in this environment, we are bombarded by all these different headlines. And all these headlines that we see in the news create a particular environment, create in a way both a sense of emergency, a sense that also things are happening at a high speed, which they are, in a way, at least in the news. But it creates also a narrative about people. And these headlines creating the narratives, in a way, we also need to talk about the executive orders. This is important to understand. When we talk about the executive orders, the migration system in the US has its challenges and has been limited for a long time. And at some point, we talked with an organization in Washington, D.C., and they were talking about the executive orders. Executive orders is a document that the president signs, and it's an order that needs to be enacted, and it's by their investiture that he can't put that in place. And these policy analysts in Washington, they were saying, the migration system in the past 10 years moves by executive orders. That means that whoever is in power either erase what was said before, like what happened with the Biden administration, what is happening now, and it changes, it moves. But these executive orders that have been kind of like provided recently target various aspects of US immigration law and policy. In a way, the goal of these executive orders are to overhaul the immigration system in border security, in asylum procedures, and it gives priority to enforcement rather to addressing other kind of things. And in these executive orders, two things have happened. One is a declaration of a national emergency at the US southern border and the classification of migration as an invasion. That is what the executive order, in a way, states. And that particular executive order then restricts, because there's this invasion, there's this declared national emergency, then that prevents anyone seeking asylum, prevents that anyone who may seeking asylum to enter the country. There's no way to do any legal entry into the US with this understanding of what is happening. So just keep in mind that these executive orders will be coming, will continue coming, and unless at the policy level, the Congress is willing to address those things, like in bipartisan agreements, things will keep moving through executive orders. So we may have these swings that will be more challenging than others to navigate. So just keep those things in mind. But in a way, the point of showing you this or discussing this is that headlines create narratives. If we are talking about a national emergency and an invasion, therefore, we have an enemy that is either in the country or entering the country. And that narrative, in a way, portrays how do we understand and how we see the other that we encounter in our day-to-day. So, I don't want to completely say what is the reality and the issues, but it's what is, from my experience in traveling at the border, from the people that I know, my contacts working on the ground, what is happening at the border? First and foremost, I want to say, and I want people to hear this very clearly. People are suffering. Yes, they are deportation. There are people that, like the ones who were deported to to Costa Rica or to Panama. Families are being separated, families are being sent back, so there's a level of suffering. People are being harmed in different ways. Temporary protection programs, what is called TPS, are being terminated, which creates another set of legal issues, but especially now has been terminated or has been readjusted in their deadline for Venezuelans and Haitians. That creates a legal problem because people who were previously admitted lawfully into the country, now they don't have the protection to remain in the country. Their work permits will be revoked. So it's very important to understand that it's, from my perspective and my experience, we are not seeing yet the impact that the executive orders may have. Yes, the headlines create this sense that a lot of is happening, that we are deporting people in mass and sending them in planes and landing in Guatemala and landing everywhere. When you look at the numbers of people being deported, and I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics here, the numbers are not even close that we have had in previous years monthly. I expect to have more. Yes, numbers will increase. There's no doubt about it. But also it's very important for us to understand if we are just having a narrative that creates all this environment of hostility and that creates this perception that we are being under threat as a nation, or what is happening. The number of people crossing the US southern border has diminished dramatically. Yes, in the past, and I won't talk about these 2 million of encounters, there's a distinction between encounters and how many people really come into the country, come into contact with CBP, and from those people, how many really enter into the country. So, but the numbers are diminishing dramatically. There are several reasons. Migration patterns respond to climate. This is a cold season. It's the winter season. If people are coming from the south, they are coming from warmer countries. So it's not the best time to come. So it's people will see during the winter time, numbers drop naturally. And the other reason is also migration patterns respond to policy changes. So if it's more difficult to move now, well, we don't move too much. Or it becomes more expensive to move when we use smugglers or where people use smugglers or other kind of ways to try to enter. At the same time, it's very important to understand, and this is, I will say something later in terms of the myths of migration. The largest number of irregular migrants, and I deliberately use the word irregular. I'm not comfortable with illegal or undocumented. I like irregular for different reasons. But the largest number of irregular migrants come from the experience of entering the US with a visa and overstaying the visa. You may be surprised to know that the second city with more Irish irregular migrants is Boston. Of course, a national from Ireland is never going to be questioned about his status because, oh, you have a cute Irish accent. Oh, sorry, I have a heavy Latino accent. But it's this idea of the largest number of irregular migrants in the US emerges from people who overstays the visa. And that's, there's a different discussion on that of how the system works and so on, but it's important to know. It's not from the people crossing the border in the southern border of the United States. And this other thing that is happening is really, with all these narratives, is there is a growing atmosphere of fear among immigrants in the US. Of course, when you see those headlines, when you see some of the officers saying you need to go and register because if not, we will hunt you, of course it creates fear. Of course it creates fear. I usually take a group of students to the border. I'm leaving tomorrow for the border to San Diego, Tijuana. I teach a course there with busy students. And I've been a little bit more anxious than in the past because of the environment, because of the narratives that are around migration. And I do believe that there is a damaging narrative around migration and about migrants that, again, creates this image that migrants are a threat to the nation. So that is what is really happening. So people are suffering. People are facing different challenges. But I will say one thing. And I will say it here and probably will repeat later. Migrants, people in the United States adjust. There's a wonderful book that is called Engage and Evade. That's what people have done. Irregular migrants have been here for many years, different waves of migrants. And that's what they do. That's how they adapt. They engage with the system in certain ways because it's inevitable. If you have children, you have to send them to school. That's a way to engaging with the system. You pay taxes. If you have to rent, you have to figure it out. So you engage the system, but also irregular migrants evade. They just don't want to be detected. And I will talk more about the going back to the myths of migration. So what is a Christian and a Catholic perspective of migration? And this is, I'm preaching to the choir, of course. You probably know more about these things by heart, by being at the School of Theology of Ministry and by your formation as Christians. But it's good just to keep in mind a couple of things that are important to understand what's supposed to be our response to migration from a Christian perspective. Of course, we have Crossing the Divide and the Incarnation. If you have heard or you have read Daniel Grudy, he has this wonderful book, and the article actually is called Crossing the Divide, which uses the image of the incarnation to talk about migration. So he said, God is the first migrant because God crosses a realm to come and be with us. So there's an experience of mobility. There's an experience of trespassing, if you want to put it in that language, trespassing into the world to be with us. So God is the first migrant, if we want to see it. Moves from one place. I won't enter into all about presence, but God enters into the world, comes to be with us. And then we have, of course, the history of the people of Israel. You were in the desert. You were wandering. You were a slave, and now you are free. It's the experience of people on the move. That is the experience of the Christian people. Then why is it that we are surprised that people want to move? And by the way, not everybody wants to move. Only 3% of the global population moves internationally. Of course, when you look at the numbers, it's a big number. But it's only 3%. That means that 97% of the global population do not move, either because they don't want to, because they can't, or because they decide to stay where they are. So just keep also those things in mind. Of course, we also have the image of the Holy Family fleeing Nazareth to go to Egypt. The experience of being a refugee, the experience of fleeing violence, of fleeing a threat, and trying to seek refuge, comfort in another place. And of course, I hope that one day one theologian writes a little bit about what is the reception, what is the Egyptians' response to the presence of, not only to the Holy Family, I don't think they were the only ones there, but what is the response from the community that receives these people? Even if you talk about, we have it days ago, the story of Joseph. He goes with the brother. The brothers come to seek help. They come to seek food. It's the Holy Family, yes, that moves, that becomes that become refugees in our terms. But it's also the community that somehow receives them. And we can only imagine how that experience of being away from home could have been. Of course, we have the beautiful image, probably is the most used image, the Good Samaritan. Going really out of your way for the other. I mean, the Good Samaritan, in a way, I have heard someone say this, he didn't have a business to really get off the road and go and see the other one. But he's the one who responds. And the Samaritan of all the people is also a foreigner. He's at the margins of his society. And he's the one who is moved, who feels compassion, who has the empathy to really go, move, and mend and tend to the needs of this person. And he's not there all the time. He leaves, but makes arrangements so people could be taken care of. Of course, we have from Pius XII, we have probably what they call the Magna Carta about the teachings of around migration, or it's one of the first documents, and we're talking about 1930s, 1940s. So it's mid-20th century, if you want to put it there. So it's pretty early. So we made, it's not 100 years yet, but it's a significant document to address how do we need to care for migrants. So the issue of mobility, I'm using issue of mobility or the phenomenon of mobility, of migration. Migration is not a problem. It's a phenomenon that we need to kind of understand and accompany. So, but it's been present and the church has responded. So you can look at theologically at all these images, all these things that we have had, and many of you have read about it, that people have written about it. I think it's just important to keep in mind that in this experience is people who move, but also how people respond from a Christian perspective to the people. And of course, we have Pope Francis with the recent letter to the Catholic bishops in the US, trying to respond in a way, or trying to say, how do we need to respond to the reality of migration in a context that is challenging? And of course, you have, all these comments from the Pope saying the act of deporting people, who in many cases have left their land, suffering violence, it's inhumane to send them back to a reality that has been violent for them and in which they will be risking their lives. Of course, here you have the tension between the right of a country to regulate who enters into the country, and it's a tension. It's not an easy, it's not a thing that could be solved easily, but it's a tension. And the right of people to seek support in another country or to seek a better life in another country. Brett O'Neill, who just defended his PhD in theology, he writes exactly about these tensions. He writes from the experience of the Australian context. But it's very interesting that his emphasis is really in talking or describing this tension. There is a tension that the challenge for us, not only for Christians, but for politicians in general, is how do we navigate from a justice and from a human rights perspective? We as Catholics or Christians, we can say from a spiritual perspective, how do we navigate this tension? And I call navigating. And those of you who like the sea and who like sailing know that navigating requires a lot of work, a lot of savviness, but also a lot of flexibility to be able to backtrack, to put the sails, to put them down, to try different things. So I always like this image of navigating. But then, of course, Pope Francis said, no matter what your stance is, our concern has to go beyond individualism. Our concern for others needs to look from needs to look beyond our inner circle. Yes, probably we are devoted in a way to tend to the needs of those who are closer to us, but that doesn't mean that we are exempt to tend to the needs of those who are outside of our inner circle. Our responsibility as I will start by saying as human beings, and our responsibility as Christians goes beyond to our inner circles. So I think it's in this stance of seeing how things are happening, I think it's important also kind of to center into what the Pope is saying nowadays, because there are very practical issues. With the rise everywhere of seeing migrants as a threat, there is on the other side a call to really see the other and recognize the other. Again, that's why I started by showing the pictures of people. Now, in the context of the US, we named this presentation a call to active solidarity. And it's, what can we do? And I will start probably by saying, don't overestimate the power of the little acts. They do make a difference. And I have learned that from the work of many people at migrant shelters. The little acts that one can contribute to changing the world do make a difference. So what can we do? And this is what I can like propose. The first one, and I think it's one of the most important things, and is the one that probably we don't talk too much about it. Remember, in the first place, our colonial past. Who were the 13 colonies? Where they came from? They came looking for religious freedom. And as they move forward, they also end up displacing people that were already here. Remember that. We're not clean in a way. I say we because I live here, but there's this sense of we need to understand our history. We need to understand the past of this country. Not in a sense of guilt or recrimination, but in a sense of recognizing where are we coming from. We need to understand that the US is a country of immigrants. The 13 colonies were immigrants. And then we need to be careful about the narrative of arriving the right way. This right way that it's often used in discussions around migration and why irregular migrants don't enter the US in the right way. The right way has changed or hasn't existed before, or not in the ways it was existed before, or the right way that exists now is inaccessible for many migrants and refugees. It's either too expensive, it's too complicated, or it's just impossible to accept, or it just takes forever to really access it. So remember all these things, because to recognize where we are coming from will help us to be more empathic with those that are in our country and face many and different challenges. Second, be careful. Be careful of narratives about migrants and migration. Be careful especially of those narratives that portray migrants as a threat. Honestly, I don't think a woman with 5 children that came from Venezuela walking, and honestly, sometimes I think like, by the grace of God, I don't see that a woman with 5 children fleeing violence is such a threat for someone. So, yes, I think that the risk would be also to sanctify the migrants. We need to be careful about sanctifying everybody. But we cannot make generalizations around migration. We cannot say, migrants are criminals, therefore all migrants are criminals. careful of those narratives that portray migrants as a threat, because once we buy into those narratives or we let those narratives get to our bones, the empathy is gone. And then we shift to a defensive attitude. And then I encourage you to learn about the myths of migration. What are the myths that we are taught about migration that is very important? There's a very interesting book. The author is Heinde Haas, and he writes a book that is called How Migration Works. He started this book, I mean, the genesis of this book is a little blog that he had with different myths of migration, and then he turned it into a book that has been translated now into 14 languages. It's very successful. And let me just give you 3 nuggets of that. 1, everybody moves. I talk a little bit, it's only 3% of the global population that moves, either forcibly, like by displacement, or seeking asylum, or because the world is too small where they live, because they want to live in a different place. I mean, and I won't say only Americans, but Americans, British people, British nationals, French, are experts at this. Once they retire, they look for the warmest place, and they retire in Puerto Vallarta, in Las Canarias. Of course, they never call themselves migrants. How they call themselves? Expats. Oh, I'm not a migrant. I'm an expat. Of course, but you live here. So that is one of the myths. The other myth is all migrants come and drain our resources. Engage and evade. Irregular migrants, the last thing that they want to do is to be detected. Many of them just want to have a job and live in peace. And if you have worked, many of you probably, or some of you have had these periods in your lives in which you have worked 3 jobs. There's no more life. There's no more time for anything else. So migrants really do not abuse the system because they cannot access the system. Furthermore, even those who use fake social security numbers, they pay taxes to that social security number. And they are never going to recover that money. They are never going to be beneficiaries of that money. That is another myth. The other myth is they come to take the jobs of many Americans. Well, any developed economy, and that's everywhere in the world, you have a labor sector that is filled by migrants. And this is the jobs that natives, that locals, do not want to do because they are labeled as dirty, dangerous, and demeaning, or because they don't want to do those jobs for the wages that those jobs pay. So let's be honest and not think that they come and take the jobs. I mean, like, if we really want to talk about taking the jobs, the high-skilled migrants are the ones who are coming to take the jobs that probably some Americans could be doing if they will have the qualifications to do those jobs. I mean, I read an article that they were saying that, oh, we are losing all the engineering jobs to the Indians in Silicon Valley. Well, you need to invest in your math programs to make Americans. Anyway, there are many myths. I can keep talking about this, but there are many myths that is very important for us to clarify. So when we engage in different kinds of conversations, we can really say, I hear what you are saying, but that's not quite accurate. Things work in a different way. Be aware that migration, and this is important too, be aware that migration policies alone will not address issues related to human mobility. Migration policies are often designed to contain, to prevent migration. It's about enforcement. I think there is a need to consider to have a much more ample overview of human mobility and understand that there are other factors that influence migration patterns: labor markets, economic and foreign policy, arms trade. So all these family reunification. So all these things. So be aware that it's not only about migration policies that will tend to this phenomenon of migration. I will say there's a need, and I'm preaching to the choir, I know, work for more just economic systems worldwide. And finally, a practical thing that we could do to support our brothers and sisters here in the United States, as some of them face very hostile and challenging environments that are charged with fear, with threat. Be informed and share information. There are programs that is called, for example, Know Your Rights. I think it's important for any of us even to read about it. So if at some point we are kind of like in a situation in which we are witnessing that someone is detained, we can support and say, this person has these rights. I will share with later kind of like a couple of materials that we have that have been produced by legal clinics around Know Your Rights programs. So that's very important. Also, have difficult conversation with those families or migrants that you know, that you are close to, about planning. It's a difficult conversation because it's about having a plan in case something happens. And plans have to do with money, have to do with housing, have to do with children, have to do with legal parenting, have to do with a lot of things. So it's important that also at some point, for those of you that you encounter, that you accompany, that you know, for them, are you prepared? It's not an easy conversation, but for us it's important to be also informed. Volunteer to create private safe spaces. With this policy in place that ICE can enter now into any place that before was considered sanctuary, places of worship, schools, and gathering spaces. Volunteer to create what is called private spaces, private places where ICE cannot enter because it's considered private space. I think just to know those things, it would be important, and just kind of like if we are part of a community or a religious community or an important gathering, we can help people or the pastor or someone to kind of how to recruit your friends who are lawyers. They will know more. Ask them to come to Mass, so in case something happens, they can just be there and help in case something happens. And lastly, I will say, listen to your immigrant friends. Do not underestimate the power of accompaniment. And if that accompaniment comes out of our experience of a God that enters the world, that wants to be with us, no matter where we are, then our accompaniment and our solidarity with migrants will be deeper because it will be grounded in our experience of God. Thank you.